Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of autistic employment.
Oh, very interesting.
We're going to be exploring an academic article titled The High Cost of Low Wages, Autistic Employment in a Rigged Economy.
Okay.
And I think this deep dive is really going to uncover some of the hidden costs behind those seemingly cheap burgers that we all love.
Right.
And really examine why the free market might not be so free after all.
Yeah, especially for autistic individuals.
Yeah.
It's a topic that really hits home when you consider that autistic unemployment in the U.S. is over 60%,
Wow.
with many of those employed struggling to make ends meet on wages below the poverty line.
It's a pretty stark reality that raises some serious questions about fairness.
Definitely.
The article uses a really interesting example to kick things off, and I'm curious to hear your take on it.
Okay.
It talks about a minimum wage hike for fast food workers in California.
Right.
What makes this seemingly simple event such a good starting point for this discussion?
Well, the article uses this event to kind of unravel this whole web of economic and social forces
Okay.
that are often hidden in plain sight.
Okay.
It starts with the CEO of McDonald's warning that raising the minimum wage to $20 an hour would force them to raise prices. Essentially, he's arguing that if you want workers to earn a living wage, the consumer will have to foot the bill.
Okay, so that's the CEO's perspective.
Right.
But the article pushes back on that pretty hard, right?
It does.
It argues that the cost of low wages isn't just reflected in the price of a burger.
Exactly.
Like, there's more to it.
Yeah, the article argues that workers, communities, and taxpayers are all subsidizing these low wages in ways we might not even realize.
Okay.
Think about, how much value you generate at work versus what you get paid. That difference, that gap, is where the tension lies.
So in a way, we're already paying for those low wages, just not directly at the cash register.
Precisely.
Okay.
If workers can't afford basic necessities on their low wages, they rely on public assistance programs.
Yeah.
It's like food stamps and Medicaid.
Right.
Those are taxpayer-funded programs designed as a safety net, but they're essentially filling the gap created by inadequate wages.
So it's like we're paying twice for that burger.
Yeah.
Once when we buy it, and again through our taxes.
Right.
What other hidden costs are we overlooking?
Well, there's also the cost of high turnover, which affects both businesses and workers. When employees are constantly leaving for better opportunities, it disrupts operations and creates additional expenses for training and recruitment.
Right.
And then there are the broader societal costs, such as the strain on healthcare systems due to the health impacts of poverty.
So this whole idea that if you're unhappy with your wages, you can simply get a better job.
Right.
The article really challenges that assumption.
It does. The article highlights the significant power imbalance between workers and employers,
Right.
particularly with the decline of unions. Workers often feel stuck in low-wage jobs, not because they lack ambition, but because they have limited options and bargaining power.
And then there's the issue of employer-tied benefits, like health insurance.
Yeah.
I remember feeling trapped at my previous job because leaving would have meant losing health coverage for my family. It really limits your choices.
It does, and it highlights how these factors, the power imbalance,
Right.
the lack of affordable alternatives, and the dependence on employer-provided benefits,
Yeah.
all contribute to a labor market that isn't truly free. It's a system that can keep workers, particularly those in low-wage sectors, from reaching their full potential.
This whole conversation about power imbalances brings us to another piece of this puzzle: lobbying.
Yes.
I know it can be a complicated topic, but how does the article connect corporate lobbying to the challenges faced by workers, especially those in low-wage jobs?
Lobbying often gets overlooked, but it plays a huge role in shaping labor regulation.
Okay.
The article explains how large corporations use lobbying to influence politicians and write the rules in their favor. They can afford to spend millions on this, while smaller businesses and individual workers don't have that kind of clout.
So even something like a minimum wage hike, which is designed to help workers, can be manipulated by corporations to benefit their bottom line.
That's the argument the article makes.
Okay.
By pushing for regulations that smaller competitors can't afford, large corporations can squeeze them out and consolidate their power.
So it's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
We've got this system where low-wage jobs are basically subsidized by all of us.
Right.
The free market isn't so free, and big corporations are wielding their influence to shape the rules of the game.
Yeah.
But how does this specifically impact autistic individuals trying to navigate this complex landscape?
That's where things get even more complicated.
Okay.
The article argues that this trend towards corporate dominance in low-wage sectors creates unique barriers for autistic workers.
Okay.
Let's start with automation.
Okay.
As large corporations invest heavily in technology to cut costs, many entry-level jobs that autistic individuals might traditionally fill are disappearing.
So it's not just about fewer jobs overall,
Right.
but also the types of jobs that are disappearing.
Exactly.
The ones that might have been more accessible to autistic individuals in the past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Smaller businesses, which might be more flexible and accommodating, are less likely to automate as quickly, but they're also being squeezed out by these larger players.
Right.
It's a double whammy for autistic workers.
And it's not just about the physical environment either, right?
Exactly.
The article also talks about how the nature of corporate jobs themselves can be challenging for autistic individuals.
That's a key point.
Yeah.
The article highlights how the standardized, often rigid routines and expectations in many corporate jobs can be particularly difficult for autistic individuals who might need more flexibility and support.
What about the role of unions?
Yeah.
Weren't they supposed to be advocates for workers' rights, especially for those who might need extra support in the workplace?
Historically, unions have been instrumental in securing accommodations and protections for disabled workers.
Okay.
But as we've discussed, union power has been declining for decades.
Right.
This leaves autistic workers, who often need additional support to navigate the workplace successfully,
Yeah.
in a more vulnerable position.
It's starting to feel like a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah.
Are there any bright spots? Any reasons for optimism when it comes to autistic employment in this system?
The article does offer some potential solutions and calls for a systemic shift in how we approach work and the value of human contribution.
Okay.
We'll delve into those in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm definitely eager to hear more about those potential solutions.
Yeah.
But before we jump into that, I think it's important for our listeners to understand the perspective of the source material itself.
You're absolutely right. We need to acknowledge that the article does present a particular viewpoint,
Okay.
one that's critical of capitalism and the role of corporations in perpetuating these inequities.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that the article frames minimum wage hikes primarily as a positive step,
Right.
without really addressing the potential downsides, like possible job losses or price increases,
Yeah.
which are often concerns raised by those with different perspectives.
Right. It's a reminder that even well-researched sources can reflect a particular bias. And it's important to be aware of that when evaluating the information presented.
So critical thinking is key, even when we're deep in the data.
Definitely.
Now, let's talk about an interesting point the article raises,
Okay.
the idea of diagnosis as a barrier.
Mm-hmm.
It seems counterintuitive that having a diagnosis could make things harder for autistic individuals.
Yeah.
Can you explain this further?
This is a really important point. The article highlights how the diagnostic criteria for autism, as outlined in the DSM-5,
Right.
the manual used by mental health professionals to diagnose conditions, have become more restrictive in recent years.
Okay.
And that can have unintended consequences for individuals seeking support.
Wait, so the system designed to identify and help autistic people
Right.
might actually be preventing some from getting the help they need.
That's the argument.
Wow.
The DSM-5 requires individuals to meet a specific set of symptoms, and that can be challenging, particularly for those who don't fit the stereotypical presentation of autism or who don't have access to specialists.
And without that official diagnosis, it becomes much harder to access things like vocational rehabilitation programs, tax incentives for employers who hire autistic individuals, and even legal protections.
Exactly. It's a catch-22.
Okay.
You need a diagnosis to get support, but the process of getting a diagnosis can be difficult and expensive, especially for marginalized communities and those without adequate resources.
So the system seems to be creating barriers even when it's supposed to be helping.
Right.
That brings us to a crucial question.
Okay.
How do we create a more equitable employment landscape for autistic individuals?
Yeah.
What does a truly inclusive and supportive workplace look like in this context?
The article dives into some potential solutions,
Okay.
but emphasizes that real change requires a fundamental shift in how we think about work value and the contributions of neurodiverse individuals.
Okay.
We'll unpack those ideas further in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah.
But for now, we'll have to leave our listeners hanging. Join us for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll explore those potential solutions and delve deeper into some of the systemic changes needed to create a more just and inclusive future for autistic individuals in the workplace.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about diagnosis as a barrier and the idea that the very system designed to help autistic individuals might actually be making things harder for some. It's a complex issue with far-reaching implications, and I'm eager to dig deeper into this with you.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation that needs more attention. We were discussing the DSM-5, which is essentially the manual that mental health professionals use to diagnose conditions like autism. And the article we're exploring raises concerns about whether the recent changes to the diagnostic criteria are actually serving the best interests of the autistic community.
I remember you mentioning that the DSM-5 has narrowed the criteria for diagnosing autism. Can you walk us through what that means and why it's potentially problematic?
Sure. In previous versions of the DSM, you could be diagnosed with autism if you met a certain number of criteria across different categories of symptoms. But the DSM-5 made things stricter. Now you have to meet all of the criteria within a specific set of categories, mainly related to social communication challenges and restrictive or repetitive behaviors.
So it's become much more specific about what counts as autism. I can see how that might create barriers for individuals who don't fit that narrow definition.
Exactly. And the article argues that this narrowing of criteria has had a disproportionate impact on certain groups, particularly females and individuals from marginalized communities.
That's an interesting point. Why would those groups be more affected by these changes?
Well, our understanding of autism has historically been based largely on observations of boys. This has led to a somewhat male-centric view of the condition, which means that girls who might express autistic traits differently are more likely to be overlooked or misdiagnosed.
So the diagnostic criteria are based on a stereotype of what autism looks like, and anyone who falls outside that narrow definition might not get the recognition and support they need.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And when you factor in things like cultural differences, language barriers, and limited access to specialists, it becomes even more challenging for people from marginalized communities to receive an accurate and timely diagnosis.
And as we discussed earlier, without that official diagnosis, it's like a whole world of support and accommodations becomes inaccessible. The article also hints at some potentially more troubling aspects of this, particularly when it comes to the influence of money and power in shaping the diagnostic landscape. What are your thoughts on that?
This is where things get a little more complicated and, frankly, a bit unsettling. The article points out that the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, the organization that publishes the DSM, receives a significant amount of funding from pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, so the organization responsible for defining mental health conditions has a financial connection to the companies that profit from treating those conditions. That does raise some questions.
It does. And the article suggests that this financial relationship could create a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility that the APA might be incentivized to narrow diagnostic criteria, which could potentially limit the number of people eligible for certain treatments or services?
So fewer diagnoses could lead to less demand for certain medications or therapies, which could ultimately impact the profits of those pharmaceutical companies. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts.
It is, and while the article doesn't make any direct accusations, it does raise important questions about whether financial motivations might be playing a role in how autism is defined and diagnosed.
If that's the case, it means that profit could be prioritized over the well-being of individuals who need support. And that's a deeply concerning thought. The article also suggests that this narrowing of diagnostic criteria might be connected to a broader societal pressure to control or medicalize neurodiversity. What are your thoughts on that argument?
It's a fascinating perspective. The idea is that our current economic system, with its emphasis on conformity and productivity, struggles to accommodate individuals who think and behave differently.
So instead of recognizing and valuing neurodiversity as a strength, the system tries to categorize it as a problem that needs to be fixed or managed.
Exactly. And the DSM, with its focus on diagnosing disorders, might unintentionally reinforce this view. It pathologizes ways of thinking and being that are simply different, not necessarily dysfunctional or harmful.
It's a subtle but powerful form of social control where anyone who doesn't fit the mold is labeled as deviant or disordered. And as we've discussed, those labels can have real consequences, limiting opportunities and perpetuating stigma.
They do. The article argues that the DSM-5, while perhaps well-intentioned, has created a system that in some ways excludes those who need support the most.
It's a lot to unpack, and it can feel overwhelming to think about these systemic issues. But the article doesn't leave us completely in the dark. It does offer a glimmer of hope, suggesting that we can shift towards a more inclusive and equitable future. Where do we even begin to envision a better way forward?
The author suggests that a fundamental shift in mindset is needed both on an individual and societal level.
Yeah.
We need to move away from the fear and stigma surrounding neurodiversity and start recognizing and valuing the unique strengths and perspectives that autistic individuals bring to the table.
So instead of trying to fix autistic individuals, we need to focus on creating a society that embraces and celebrates their differences.
Exactly.
Huh.
The article calls for a more holistic approach to support one that moves away from the medical model of disability, which focuses on deficits and limitations, and towards a model that sees neurodiversity as a natural form of human variation.
That sounds like a major shift. What would that look like in practice?
For starters, it would involve shifting decision-making power from medical professionals and institutions to autistic individuals themselves.
So more self-advocacy, more autistic voices shaping the policies and programs that affect their lives.
Precisely. It also means moving away from the idea of fixing autism and focusing on providing support and accommodations that allow autistic individuals to thrive on their own terms. This could involve things like flexible work arrangements, sensory-friendly environments, and access to communication and social skills training that respects individual needs and preferences.
It sounds like it's about creating a world where autistic individuals are not just tolerated, but truly valued for their unique contributions.
That's the goal. The article argues that embracing neurodiversity is not just about social justice. It's about recognizing the immense value and talent that neurodiverse individuals bring to the table.
It's about tapping into a wellspring of creativity, innovation, and problem-solving skills that are often overlooked or underestimated.
Absolutely. The article emphasizes that building a more equitable and inclusive society benefits everyone, not just those who have been marginalized or excluded.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to contribute their talents and reach their full potential, regardless of how their brains are wired.
And that leads us to the author's thought-provoking question. Is capitalism, with its relentless pursuit of profit, inherently incompatible with true equity for autistic individuals? It's a question that challenges us to critically examine our economic system and its impact on the lives of those who might not fit the traditional mold.
It's a lot to ponder. But it's a crucial conversation to have if we're serious about creating a better world for autistic individuals and for everyone. Join us for part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll move beyond critique and explore concrete steps we can all take to create a more just and inclusive future for autistic individuals in the workplace and beyond. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the hidden costs of low wages to the complexities of diagnosis and the challenges of fitting into a system that doesn't always value neurodiversity. It can feel heavy, but in this final part, let's shift our focus from critique to action. What can we actually do to create a more inclusive and equitable world for autistic individuals?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these challenges, but the article reminds us that change starts with individual actions. Even seemingly small steps, when multiplied across communities, can create a ripple effect that leads to real transformation.
So it's not about waiting for some top-down revolution. It's about each of us taking responsibility and doing what we can right where we are. What are some concrete actions our listeners can take to make a difference?
Well, first and foremost, educate yourself. We've only scratched the surface of this complex issue today, so continue exploring the resources mentioned in the article. Seek out diverse perspectives on autistic employment and challenge your own assumptions about neurodiversity.
Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand the nuances of these challenges, the better equipped we are to advocate for meaningful change.
Absolutely. And speaking of advocacy, don't underestimate the power of your voice. Contact your elected officials, support organizations working for disability rights, and speak up against injustice whenever you encounter it.
Sometimes it feels like those individual actions get lost in the noise. But when we raise our voices collectively, we can create real pressure for systemic change. What are some other ways to contribute?
Think about the spaces you inhabit. Challenge stereotypes, amplify autistic voices, and promote a culture of acceptance and inclusion in your communities. You can volunteer your time to organizations that support autistic individuals, or simply have open and honest conversations with friends and family about the importance of neurodiversity.
Those everyday interactions can really shift perspectives over time. And for those who are in positions of influence, particularly employers or those in leadership roles within organizations, what are some steps they can take to create more welcoming and supportive workplaces for autistic individuals?
There's so much that can be done. Start by implementing flexible work arrangements, providing sensory-friendly spaces, and offering training on neurodiversity awareness for all employees.
It's about going beyond simply checking the box on diversity to truly valuing the unique contributions of neurodivergent individuals.
Exactly. Actively seek out and recruit autistic talent. Partner with organizations that specialize in connecting employers with autistic job seekers. And make sure your company culture is one that celebrates differences and embraces the strengths that neurodiversity brings to the table.
It's about shifting the mindset from seeing neurodiversity as a challenge to recognizing it as a valuable asset. What are some of the benefits that employers might see when they create a more inclusive workplace for autistic individuals?
There are so many potential benefits. Autistic individuals often bring unique skills and perspectives to the workplace, including strong attention to detail, analytical thinking, problem-solving abilities, and a different way of approaching tasks.
It's about tapping into that potential and creating an environment where those talents can flourish.
Right. And studies have shown that companies with diverse workforces tend to be more innovative and successful. When you create a workplace where everyone feels valued and respected, it fosters a more positive and productive environment for everyone.
So supporting autistic employment isn't just about altruism. It's about recognizing the tangible benefits that neurodiversity brings to businesses and organizations.
Exactly. It's a win-win situation.
Yeah.
And it all comes back to that fundamental question the article poses. Can we create a system where profit and equity can coexist?
It's a question that challenges us to rethink our priorities and consider the long-term implications of our choices.
The path forward requires us to move beyond fear and prejudice and embrace the richness and complexity of human diversity in all its forms.
It's a powerful call to action. So, to our listeners, we leave you with this. What will you do in your own life and in your sphere of influence to create a world where autistic individuals can not only survive, but truly thrive?
Share your thoughts, continue the conversation, and let's work together to build a future where neurodiversity is not just accepted, but celebrated.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.